So let's talk about personality. What is personality? So personality is defined as consistent behavioral patterns and interpersonal processes of an individual. And so when we talk about your personality, we're talking about your consistent patterns of behavior. And so when we talk about personality, there are two major things we need to distinguish first before we dive into the study of personality. We have traits, and then we also have states. So traits refer to relatively permanent characteristics of an individual, and then states refer to temporal characteristics of an individual. So when we talk about traits, we mean descriptions like he's friendly, he's shy. These are relatively permanent. And then when we say states are temporal. They're usually in reaction to a particular stimulus, right? Like things like anger, right? You can't be angry your entire life. You'll be angry for a short period of time, usually in response to something. Yeah. So the next thing we'll talk about the theories of personality. So in order to explain where people get their personality from or how personality arises, there are several theories. However, I'll only talk about three. The first theory is called the social learning theory. So in the social learning theory, we're borrowing ideas from the behaviorist perspective. And so this theory is solely based on the idea of empiricism. So we're saying every human being is like a blank slate. And then if you remember, John Locke called this tabula rasa, which meant that we gain information from our environment. And so that's where we acquire our personality from. That's what the social learning theory is saying. The second one is the self theory. This one was by Carl Rogers. And so it focuses on the idea of self-awareness and free will, saying through self-awareness and through free will, that's how we gain our personality. And then lastly, we have the psychoanalytic theory by Sigmund Freud. And so this one will be the majority of today's discussion because for some reason his work was more accepted than the other theories. And so in the psychoanalytic theory, what gives individuals their personality? So personality can result from two things according to Freud. One, it can result from our instincts, and then two, it can result from the structure of our personality. Let's talk about the instincts. So Freud believed that human beings are instinctively born with two types of instincts. So we have eros, which is the instinct of life, and then we have thanatos, which is that of death. So eros, if you remember in our previous video we discussed this, we said eros involves life preservation and reproduction, and then thanatos is oriented towards self-destruction, right? So I was saying these instincts, right, they motivate us, right? They motivate us, and then they cause motivation of our thoughts, our emotions, and finally our behavior. And that's how we gain our personality. And then Freud also said there is another way in which we gain our personality, and that's through the structure of the personality. And so he thought every human being has three systems to their personality, or three parts of their personality. We have the id, we have the ego, and the superego. And then he said personality depends on the distribution of psychic energy to each and every one of these systems. And so what he was trying to say is that depending on which one is more dominant, your id or your id, your ego or your superego, that is what will determine your personality. So let's go into more detail as to what the id, what the ego, and what the superego is. So let's talk about the id. So what is the id? So according to Freud, he thought the id was this system of your personality, or this part of your personality that is present at birth, and then it is a fundamental part of your mind. So it operates on the pleasure principle. What does this mean? This means that its function is to ensure that the particular individual is comfortable. It only cares about itself. And then because of this reason, it satisfies all your basic needs, meaning your need for food, your need for, your need for water, your need for it just that it cares about itself. That's what the ID is about. It cares about itself and does not care about others. That's the first part to develop. This explains why children at younger ages, especially below the age of 3, are only aware of themselves and not others. And so individuals that grow up with a very strong ID or a very strong id tend to be hedonistic in nature. What does that mean? It means they believe pleasure is the most important thing for them, right? And they become selfish, they become destructive, they become aggressive. And then the next thing to develop is your ego. So when does your ego develop? According to Freud, your ego develops at the age of 3. That's just after the phallic stage. Okay, we'll discuss that later. So your ego develops after the age of 3. So when you turn 3, you develop the ego. So the ego works on the reality principle. Unlike the id, which works on the pleasure principle, the ego is aware of the environment. By the environment, I mean it's aware of people around. And then its major function is to meet the needs of the id while considering the needs of others. So that's what the ego does. That's what its function is. And then people with a very strong ego are more responsible and they are healthy. So a healthy individual should have a very strong ego. That's what Freud thought. The next thing to develop is your superego. So your superego develops at the age of 5. And so when you develop your superego, it works on the idealistic principle. And so your superego is associated with your sense of morality or your sense of ethical restraint. And then usually morality and ethical restraint are taught by your caregivers. So what they tell you, oh, this is wrong, do not do this. Those ideas are kept in your mind and then they are integrated as being part of the superego. And so people who have a very strong superego tend to be very good at obeying authorities, and they tend to be more reserved, and this is what you'll be able to see. And so the next thing we can discuss is the idea of psychosocial development. And so in psychosexual development, and then in psychosexual development we have certain stages. We have 5. So we have the oral stage, the anal stage, the phallic stage, we have the latent stage, the latency stage, and then we have the genital stage. So let's explain this and then we'll end our video. So the oral stage occurs from birth to around 18 months. And so in this stage, the major source of pleasure is your mouth, right? So one thing you'll be able to see is that the child at this stage gains pleasure through sucking. And so overgratification, meaning overgratification at this stage will cause an oral fixation, which can lead the child to be more likely to smoke, more likely to drink, more likely to bite their nails and all those other related things. And then the next stage is the anal stage. So during the anal stage, the main focus of pleasure is the anus. And so at this stage, the idea is the concept of retaining and expelling feces, right? And so toilet training is a very important thing or aspect at this stage. And so what happens when you overtrain your kids? So when you overtrain the child, they become perfectionists, or they become clean or too neat, right? Because overtraining them is quite related to retaining of feces. And so they become, it starts to show in their personality. And then according to Freud, what happens when you undertrain them? So when you undertrain them, they become messy and they become chaotic or they become careless. The next stage is the phallic stage. So the phallic stage happens between 3 to 7. And so phallic comes from a Greek word phallus, which means the penis. And so the major focus of pleasure here is the genitals, specifically the penis. There's this concept of penis envy here. And so the children start to be fond of the appearance of the opposite sex. And then depending on whether the child is a male or whether the child is a female, we have a term for that. So when a male is fond of the female, we say when a male is fond of the mother, we say this is Oedipus complex. And then when the opposite is true, when a female is fond of the father, we say this is Electra complex. And so at this stage, for males, they develop an unconscious sexual desire for their mothers. And then what happens is that they become rivals with their father. And then their sexual orientation at the end of the day will depend on the father's ability to exercise, or let me say, to exercise dominance. Because at this stage, what they think is that even though they are rivals with their father, they fear him. Reason, they believe he's capable of castrating them. And then over time, they start to identify with him because they view him as being more superior. And then as they identify with him, they decide to identify as being masculine, as being male, right? And so, according to Freud, sexual deviance, meaning things like being gay or being heterosexual, being a lesbian or whatnot, results from dysregulation at this stage. The next stage in psychosexual development is the latency stage, which happens between the age of 6 to puberty. So at this stage, sexual urges remain repressed, right? And then the child starts to play with other children of the same sex. And then the last stage will be the genital stage. In the genital stage, sexual urges awake, right? This one happens at puberty. And then the child at this stage knows with certainty their sexual orientation, right? And then in a child that has developed normally, usually their sexual orientation will be towards the opposite gender. And so that sums up a majority of the content. The only thing left is we'll discuss the defense mechanisms in the next video.